Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Filter. On this show, we recognize that the world can be a confusing place to live in. So what I seek to do on this show is to equip you to live with biblical clarity in our confusing world, so that you can face the chaos of life with wisdom, integrity, and courage. Can I be a woman born in a man's body? Is it possible that God could have made a mistake when he made me? Is the idea of gender merely a social construct that I should reject in order to be my true self? These questions are the kind of thoughts that many teenagers and young adults in our culture are considering. People find it shocking to discover that those who identify as LGBTQ+ are on a sharp increase in Gen Z. Those who are discerning Christians should ask why. How can we respond? And what do we do to protect our children from gender confusion? My guest on today's show is Sarah Zylstra, a writer at the Gospel Coalition who has done excellent work investigating this topic to answer these questions. Sarah Zylstra is senior writer and faith and work editor for the Gospel Coalition. She is also the co-author of Gospel Bound, Living with Resolute Hope in an Anxious Age, and editor of Social Sanity in an Insta World. Before that, she wrote for Christianity Today, homeschooled her children, freelanced for a local daily paper, and taught at Trinity Christian College. She earned a bachelor's in English and Communication from Dordt University and a master's from Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern University. She lives with her husband and two sons in the suburbs of Chicago, where they are active members of Orland Park Christian Reformed Church. Before we get into this episode, let me encourage you to subscribe to our email list if you have not done so already. Just click on the link in the show notes and you can sign up on my website so that you get all future content sent directly into your inbox whenever it comes out. Be sure that you are subscribed to Filter wherever you get your podcasts so that you can get all future episodes right on your homepage. You can subscribe to us on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Lastly, if you enjoyed this episode or you were helped by it, let me encourage you to leave us a rating and review and share this show with your friends. Leave Filter a 5-star rating on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and write a review for us on Apple Podcasts. When you take these simple steps, it greatly helps us to get the message of biblical clarity out to more people. Well, without any further delay, let's jump into this conversation that I got to have with Sarah Zylstra. Sarah, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thank you so much for having me.
Well, thank you for taking the time. I'm sure you've got plenty on your plate. TGC keeping you busy with articles and whatever else it is you do over there. Tell us about what you do. What's your job at TGC?
Yeah, so I have literally the best job in the world, which is I find and report stories of where God is at work in the world. So anywhere that there's a place that the Holy Spirit is moving in a really unexpected way, because obviously we know God is at work everywhere all the time. But if the Holy Spirit is doing something really unexpected, or there's something beautiful or an outcome that's astonishing that happens somewhere, that's where I'm trying to go to tell that story.
Very interesting. So is there like any specific area that you're looking for those kind of stories? Or like, are you looking for stories in missions, stories in the workplace, stories in politics? Like what is it exactly? Is there a scope, or is it a broad field?
Good question. It's a broad field. I'll tell any story anywhere. I will tell a story of something that happens at someone's work. I'll tell a story all over the globe, any country, if there's something. So you can imagine it has to be something pretty amazing to rise to the top. I can't tell every story. So I'm just telling the ones that would probably make you think, whoa, I want to call my mom. That's the kind of story that I want to tell.
Interesting. So how do you find these stories, and then how do you filter them to choose which ones you're going to write about and which ones are neat, but just not for your blog?
Yeah. So the ones that we write about are ones where it's clearly a work of God, something supernatural is happening. And like I said, it makes you want to call your friend, or it's something that'd be like, if I ran into you on the street, I would just say, hey, you're not going to believe this. Let me tell you this thing I just heard. So that's one of the ways that we filter it. We found them just by the beginning. When I started doing this 4 or 5 years ago, Colin, my editor, just knew of a couple. And so he's like, well, why don't you just start on these? And then we weren't even sure how far I would get. Like at some point, is it going to kind of die out and there wouldn't be more stories? Oh, us of little faith. There were always more stories. And the longer I do this, the more stories come to me, because now people are like, oh, that's such a cool story. I know a girl who would tell a story like that. And so the more people that I talk to, the more stories I'm getting.
Interesting. And so you've been doing this for 4 or 5 years, you said?
Yep.
Yeah. And so were you doing something else for TGC before that? Or is that was that your role starting out?
Yeah, it was. Before that, I was at Christianity Today for about 13 years. And before that, I was in school. So that's sort of been and I did a couple other, most of CT, what I did there, I was a contractor, so I could also fit in some other things. So had some kids, homeschooled them for a while, taught for a little bit at a local Christian college, wrote for some daily newspapers. You kind of puzzle piece together what you're going to do with your time in those little kid years. So about 4 or 5 years ago, maybe a little bit longer even, I came over to TGC full time, and I've been doing that ever since.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So what do you think? So as a journalist, what are some of the, how does being a Christian affect the way that you do journalism in all these years? Have you written for both Christian and non-Christian publications? What do you think makes your Christian worldview of faith unique when it comes to doing your work as a journalist?
I think the Christian journalist has an enormous leg up on a non-Christian journalist, because a Christian journalist knows what's going on, right? If you don't have a foundation that you're standing on, if you don't understand why the world was created and how it was created and what it was created for, and the larger scope of creation, fall, redemption, you are lost. Like something happens and you can't tell if it's good or bad. Something happens and you can't tell if it's big news or small news. You're just kind of pushed around a lot by what people are screaming about at the moment. And I think having a Christian rootedness in being able to tell, like, oh, that's just not a big deal, or oh, this thing that looks small is actually a really big deal. That is just a gift that I think only a Christian journalist can see, or be very hard.
And so, in your years of your years of writing these stories for TGC, what are some that stand out? I know we're gonna get to your recent article on transgender phenomena among youth, but other than that, before we get into that one, what are some ones that stand out that have really just stuck with you, and maybe even really challenged and growing your faith as you've been able to research them and write about them?
Good question. What I did toward the beginning was my editor said to me, find out what happened in Seattle after Mars Hill fell and Mark Driscoll left. Like, what happened he had 13,000 people in that church. Did they all just walk away from the faith? What happened to those guys? I thought they all just walked away from the faith. I don't know what I thought. I just thought they disappeared. But when I went over there and started talking to pastors, what happened was God was at work even in that hard situation. And not all of them, some of them truly did have a lot of hurt and walk away from the faith, but most of them landed at local churches. And they had gone through a lot of pain, but they had also been well taught. So they came in asking good questions. They came in well discipled in their faith. They came in with really good theology. They came in ready to serve. And they came in loving Jesus. And so they were just, when Mars Hill collapsed, it was just like a water balloon popping. And then all those people just ran into these local churches and found homes there, and just were a source of great encouragement and life in that whole area of those local churches. So that was it was encouraging to me, and looking at a place where you didn't think there was going to be any good, and finding some.
Yeah. Yeah. And those are the stories after a big story like that you don't really get to hear about. Everybody hears about the big explosion or the scandal, but not really how God's grace can come in and heal and intervene in the aftermath of the scandal. Any others that really stand out to you?
Yeah, I just did one kind of along those same lines. Then after a while, like over the past year or so, I really wanted to look in dark places, because I started seeing, like, okay, if God is really at work everywhere, is he in the darkest place? So I don't know if you remember when Afghanistan collapsed last year, and and the airport.
Don't know if I remember. Yeah.
That one time. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it was just a disaster, a wreck. But we knew some people who were working out in that area, actually in the United Arab Emirates. And I knew that they worked with a lot of people in the larger region. So I asked if they knew anything. And they said, we have a story that's unfolding right now. Check back. And I kept checking back and I kept checking back. And eventually I got to tell the story this spring in an audio story. It's called Escape from Kabul. And it's basically the story of this Afghan house church network, which had been growing so unexpectedly, because there's really never been, even when the Americans were there was never a chance for missionaries to come in openly. So everything had to be done secretly, and they were persecuted violently. And still it was growing. And they had been connected a couple years back with these missionaries that we knew who were in the United Arab Emirates. And those missionaries, most of them had come out of Capitol Hill Baptist Church, where Mark Dever preaches. And so they had been working on the Hill before they became missionaries and moved out here. And so when everything was collapsing and falling apart, it was just this beautiful picture of these Afghan Christians who were trapped, but who were connected to and loved by missionaries in Dubai, who were connected to and loved by churches and senators and people who worked on the Hill in Washington, D.C. And to see the way that they could operate and work to pull these Christians out into safety was just gives me goosebumps, the way that God moved all the pieces in the exact right way.
Wow. Wow, that sounds awesome. I remember seeing whenever that story came out, but I'm sad to admit I did not. It's an audio story, you said, or is there video content too?
It's audio. It's a podcast.
An audio story.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah. So I haven't listened to it, but I'm going to include it in the show notes. So for anyone who's interested in hearing that story, I know I'm going to go listen to it now. But anyone who's interested in hearing that story, I'm going to have it linked in the show notes. So make sure you guys go check it out there. But yeah. So that sounds great. I reached out to you to talk about this other recent article you had written. I say recent. This was probably maybe a month or two ago now that this one had come out on transgender youth and sort of the phenomenon that we've been seeing of these youth in high schools and different communities around the country all coming out and declaring that they are now transgender or non-binary or something else along those lines, and wanting to make all these lifestyle changes, and then the reactions of parents and so on. It's an excellent article. How did you come across this story?
Yeah, we weren't actually looking for this story. What I was looking for was advice. The Gospel Coalition exists to help and support the local church, and we could see this phenomenon like you did. And we were hearing from pastors who would have a person or two in their church who is transgender, or more likely the parents of a person who is transgender, and they were trying to walk with families through this. And so we were trying to find, reap wisdom, talk to pastors and say, what are you saying? What's helping? How can we share, kind of find together best practices or advice that we can help each other through this. It was hard to find from the pastors, honestly, because it's just so new. Honestly, this phenomenon is just a couple of years old. And so it's hard to see how it's going to play out. And it's very difficult for them to figure that out yet. But one of them said to me, listen, there is a woman in my church that you should talk to. And that was Eva. I call her Eva. Their names have been changed in this story because there's a lot of transgender activists who wouldn't like this story.
Yeah.
So we wanted to keep them a little bit protected. And yet she told me a story that was phenomenal and so encouraging and hopeful. And so that's why I knew we had to share that one.
Yeah. So for those who haven't read it yet, it'll also be linked in the show notes. So you guys go read the full article after this. Or for those who haven't read it yet, go ahead and just tell us the story. Take your time, tell us whatever, as much detail or little as you want, leave for them to go read later. And yeah, how it unfolded and what you learned and whenever you were getting to know Eva.
Okay. I can talk for a long time, so just interrupt me if you have questions, or I'm going to.
Okay.
So there was a girl called Grace, not her real name, and she was about 11 or 12 years old, and she wanted to go on a website called DeviantArt. It's a social media website, and it's a place where people share art with each other. And her mom thought that was fine. So she got on this website and shared her art, and in the process of doing so, ran into a pretty thriving LGBTQ community online. And they told her about stuff like transgenderism. And when they first told her, she didn't even know what that was. And so she asked them, and they said, oh, it's when a girl can be a boy and a boy can be a girl, or you don't have to be either one. You could be something else. And so she asked her mom about it. And her mom, who is a faithful Christian, they've got, her parents love Jesus. They love each other. They take her to church. They're involved. They're just as, gospel centered as you would imagine or would love to be. Her mom said to her, you know what, that's not how God planned things. She took her to the Bible. She explained things to her. And then Grace went back to the internet and told her friends there, oh, I don't think transgenderism is right. And this is why. I believe God made us male and female. Well, her mom got a little bit scared and thought, I think she's going to get bullied for this. But she didn't. Instead, her friends online and her friends at school invited her to a group that met at lunchtimes that's called the Genders and Sexualities Alliance. And in Grace's school, that means that for an hour at lunch, I think it's once a week or once every other week or so, they meet together and they talk. In Grace's school, this is unsupervised, although in some schools it's supervised by a teacher. And you talk about your body, you talk about sex, you talk about all manner of different kinds of sex. You talk about how uncomfortable you feel. You talk about ways that maybe you could feel different in a different kind of a body.
And this is in a public or private school?
Public school.
Public school?
Yeah. Yep. And so they, after a while, Grace, who was 12 and who did feel uncomfortable in her body because she was 12, and every 12-year-old feels uncomfortable in their body. And also because when she looked at the other girls in her school, the way they were dressing was pretty sexy. They had pretty tight clothes, pretty short clothes. And she felt uncomfortable with that. And so she started to think, maybe I'm agender, like maybe I'm genderless. Maybe I'm, that's kind of seems like where I think I fit. But then after a few months or even weeks later, she started to think, hey, maybe I'd actually like to be a boy. Because one thing they talked about in their group was how if you just took some hormones, you could become another gender. They didn't talk about, I don't know if they didn't know, I'm assuming they just didn't know all the many, many problems that come along with hormone therapy and medications and all the ways that it messes up your body, sometimes, many times permanently and severely. Yeah. All they thought, she literally just thought like I could take some pills or I could have some shots and I could be as tall and strong as my brother. And wouldn't that be awesome? I think that's what I would like to do. So she told her mom, emailed her. Her mom was at a church lunch when she got it. And she said, I'm a boy and I want my pronouns to be they and them. And her mom just could not believe it. This was just a couple months after she had written that thing on social media. And so the turnaround time of that was so fast. She just felt like she got punched right in the gut. It just made her sick. She's like, I couldn't even sleep. I was so worried about this and felt so much stress about this. And this was a couple of years ago. So while there are few resources now, there were even fewer resources back then.
Yeah.
So she was.
And so in these few months, she's 12 years old, you said, right? So she's in middle school or so. 7th grade. Had started going to all these meetings where they were discussing these things, even encouraging her to possibly look into hormones. This whole time, the mom had no idea because there was no supervision.
Is that right? Supervision. And they don't, like a lot of times if you're in school, they say, hey, well, if your kid wants to be in French club or chess club or something, you have to sign up. But that's not how this club works because there's a fear that the parents will want to stop the kids, right? Because we live in this place that seems like, oh, the parents are against us. They're going to want to stop you from going, stop you from exploring who you really are. And so we need to have a shield between the children and their parents. And that's how the GSA club, that's kind of the mentality there. So they also don't keep record of who's been there because they don't want, when the parents call, they don't want to be able to say, oh yeah, your kid was here or not. They just say, sorry, we don't know who was here or not.
Yeah.
thinking that
Okay.
they're protecting the children. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
From the
Yeah.
kids.
Wow.
Yeah. Yep. Okay. So here she is. She doesn't know what to do. She asks the mom asks the school counselor. She talks to the principal. She talks to the pediatrician, and she hears over and over again the same line, which is, if you don't affirm, then your child will commit suicide. You can either have an alive son or a dead daughter, they say to her. And she has a background in psychology and education. And she's like, I could think of 15 reasons why my 12-year-old girl would feel uncomfortable in her body and wish that she could be a boy, other than that she actually is a boy and that I have to affirm her or she's going to commit suicide. This just doesn't feel right. And it felt even less right. She finished 7th grade year and they went through the summer, and she became a lot less militant and a lot more relaxed about it. And her mom thought, oh, we're coming out of it. This is going to be okay. She's kind of starting to come back to herself. And then she said the first day of 8th grade, she was right back in it up to her neck. Like she just was militant and strong about it again. And that's when her mom bought a book on how to get someone out of a cult. So there's a couple mistakes that Eva will tell you that she made. The first one was allowing Grace to ever get on that social media site and the website in the first place. And the second one was they left her in school again for her 8th grade year in that same school she was at before. And for Grace, this was awesome because she's on the autism spectrum, and she felt socially awkward before. But she said once she said she was transgender, it was like eating the mushroom in Mario Kart, which makes you become invincible. Like it was like she had superpowers. Now she was popular. Now the kids would come up to her and say, we're so proud of you. We love you so much. You're so amazing. You're so brave. She could talk to anybody at any time. They were seeking her out, and she just felt like she was on top of the world. So you can imagine how difficult it would be to remove her from a situation like that. Yeah. And yet the very first rule of getting someone out of a cult is to remove them physically from as much as you can from the situation that they're in. And so after the finishing of her 8th grade year, her mom said, listen, you're not going to go back for high school. We're going to do some homeschooling. And so she took her out and she started to homeschool her for high school. The second rule of getting someone out of a cult is to build really healthy relationships with them. And this is something that homeschooling also helped with, because now you're talking about English and you're talking about math and you're talking about science. You're not just fighting over gender. You're talking about a whole bunch of different things. You're going on field trips together. You're cooking together. You're just building up these other healthy, good relationships around it. Mm-hmm. And then the third principle of getting someone out of a cult is to ask them a lot of questions. And they were asking her a lot of questions, but she couldn't hear anything that they were saying. And in some of my other research, parents said the same thing. Like when they were trying to engage their children on this issue, the kids would say back to them, almost like a script, trans women are women, or trans rights are human rights, or love is love, just like a slogan that you might see on a sign, but it's just the language that's in their head that's just coming out, and it's just sort of a barrier to any sort of real engagement with what's going on.
Yeah, Thaddeus Williams, another TGC writer, he talks about that as like an operating system. Mm. So, he says that there's this operating system that comes with these ideologies where just like with an operating system with a computer or iPhone, you put in X and it gives you Y, you put in S, it gives you T. And, so that's how they're taught how to think. And he said, if you just have like these, like 12 or maybe even less than that, maybe it's just like 4 or 5 different responses, then you can shut down everything anyone says to you.
Yeah. Yeah. And so that's what she had as well. But her mom put her in a homeschooling group. And the kids in there were more conservative, and they started asking her questions. And even it could be the same question that her mom asked her, but when you're at this point 13 or 14 or whatever, you can hear it, right? From your peers, she could hear it. And so she thought, I'm just, I'm right, they're wrong. I'm going to research the snot out of this, and I am really going to make sure, irrefutably prove that this is okay and that this is, accepted and good. And she researched and researched and researched, and along the way was like, I can't prove that this is logical. I can't prove that this makes sense. This doesn't make sense. What if I'm wrong? Is what she started to think as time went along. Probably about this point is when she started to what her mom calls boomerang. And so she would like she would like go get her nails done or something with her mom. And then the next day she'd write, and her mom would be really excited. And the next day she'd write he, him on all of her nails. And so she's like sort of swinging back and forth between feminine stuff and then back into masculine, and feminine and back into masculine. But her mom said that's actually a hopeful sign. Now that they've talked to other families who have done this too, she's like, we see this a lot. Actually, if someone's about to desist or come back to their original self, then they start to boomerang like that and go back and forth, which is what happened to her. And then eventually, she was on a walk with her dog. One interesting thing is that she never lost her faith through all of this. And so she said, this is what I told myself. God made me, meant for me to be a boy. In God's good plan, I was supposed to be a boy, but because there is sin in the world, that's how I accidentally got put in this wrong body, and it's broken and fallen, but that's, how I'm here. But she had a job where she walked her neighbor's dog, and she was on a walk with her dog. And at this point, we're about 2 years in now. She said, I was praying and I knew I couldn't be a Christian and transgender at the same time. I knew I would have to pick. And so she said, God, fine, whatever, I guess I'll be a girl. And within a week or two, all of her transgender feelings had disappeared. I don't want to say this as a prescription because I don't think that's the way it happens for everyone. But in this case, that's what happened for Grace.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, that's amazing. That I have never heard that rationalization before that you shared, that she had about how God made me this way, but sin came in. Because I think from a more orthodox position, we've always explained it the opposite way. I know the gender that you're born with is God who intended you to be. It's the fallenness of our world that caused you to struggle with that. But she turned that on its head.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. I've never heard that. I wonder if that's something that someone told her, or do you know, is that something that she learned from somewhere, or is there, maybe some more progressive resources out there that are teaching that?
I don't know.
Or did she just come up with that?
But she goes to a church with Reformed theology. And you can kind of see it, right? Like the doctrine of depravity, like you could sort of see how she could get there from like, oh, everything is broken. Oh, we're working towards the redemption of all things. Like, wouldn't me taking hormones be working toward the redemption of my body? I can kind of see how she could shoehorn that in there.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. And so, how long ago was the sort of the resolution of this story?
It's been a couple years now. I'm not exactly sure.
Yeah. So, do you know, like, what has life been like for Grace since then? Since detransitioning, which she never really fully transitioned other than changing her pronouns. But do you know what the kind of the epilogue for this story has been?
So she is still homeschooling, and she says to me that she is much, much happier now in her girl body. She is, I think, maybe angry is not the right word, but definitely speaking out against the manipulation of the worldview of transgenderism. It feels like, a lot of lies that were told to her, and that's frustrating. Thinking about colleges, like every other normal girl her age. Her mom said when she first said to her, okay, I'm back to being a girl, she didn't trust it quite at first. Like when someone gives you really, really good news and you're like, I'm not exactly sure. So she said it took a couple weeks before that really sunk in. I think what made her detransitioning easier is that her parents gave as little ground as they possibly could. And so they would call her by the nickname that she had chosen for herself, which was gender neutral, but they didn't call her they and them. They said, we're going to stick with your original pronouns. The line that they drew, they said was, we're not going to be deceptive. So yes, you may wear baggier clothes. No, you may not wear a man's suit. Yes, you don't have to wear a dress to church, but you have to go to church. We'll call you this name, which is a gender neutral, nickname, because a lot of people have nicknames, but we're not going to call you a different pronoun. Like they held her pretty close. And the more her, one pastor I talked to named Sam Ferguson said that he counsels that as well, because every inch that you give, you then have to fight back if your child is going to desist. And so the fewer changes you make, the fewer battles you have on their way back, which I think is interesting.
Yeah. And then praise God, since she had good parents, that she wasn't allowed to go on any kind of hormone therapy,
which is almost impossible.
Where there's sometimes there's no coming back. Yeah. So have you in researching this story encountered similar stories other than Grace?
I am hearing from a lot of parents, but the parents I'm hearing from are mostly saying that there's still not a lot of them have desisted yet. They're still in that stuck phase of the transgenderism phase. Many of them say to me the two things that Eva pointed out as well. Social media is a huge, strong influence, and the social peer pressure at their public school has been a really big, strong influence. The parents I hear from almost always have those two things in common.
So I think it's interesting from what I've read. Historically, those who were they used to be called transsexuals, those who identified with the opposite gender and would maybe cross dress. Historically, it was always men who would identify as women. But now what we're seeing today is we're seeing that that trend actually reverse, and now it's far more likely to be women who are identifying as transgender or non-binary. And then on top of that, it's young women, and it seems to happen in clusters, right? It's like at one public school or one community here and there. It starts with a couple and then just explodes. And so people are arguing, is this just the trend of humanity, or is there something social that's happening? In your research, looking at this story and others, what kind of insight can you give there to how this phenomenon is spreading and what's driving it?
There is definitely, without a doubt, a social component here. There is, if you look at the numbers, so I'm in Gen X, and 5% of my generation is part of the LGBTQ community. The millennials, who are one step down from me, 10%, so doubles. The Gen Z, which is 25 and under, 20% identify as LGBTQ. There is just no medical way that you go from a 5% to 20% of the population in such a short amount of time, like biologically speaking. That's just illogical. And you can also point to the other factors, certainly the social media and the public school system. I mean, what we're seeing there is girls together, right? And we know that girls are influenced by each other. We've known this for all of time. We even can see this in trends of like a high school where a lot of girls get pregnant around the same time. Like they wear the same clothes, they go to the bathroom together. If one of them, there's a lot of, for good and for ill, influencing of each other in that, especially at an age when you're in middle school and high school. So I that's definitely just true.
Yeah. And so what are some of the best ways that parents can protect their children? And we can talk about how we respond once a youth, I sound like an old person. Once a young person, gosh, I can't believe I just said youth. Once a young person says, I'm transgender or non-binary, then we got to be reactive. But if we're going to be proactive and protect our children against these ideologies, which are just being crammed down from all over the place in our culture. And talking to these parents, listening to these stories, what are some of the key things you've learned that families should be doing, parents should be doing to be proactive in protecting our children?
Yeah. One thing that I'm observing is that it is way, way easier to protect your child up front than it is to pull them through a desisting or a coming back from this. It is so incredibly difficult and painful and heartbreaking when your kid comes to you and says, I decided I'm transgender. So it's so much easier, if you can, to catch them before that. The main two things, as I said, that I'm seeing, which I would caution parents to be really careful about, are social media use, especially among girls. Are they on? If they are and they're trying to hide from you, they can and they will. Grace, her parents pulled her off of social media and she started using a Google Doc. Like she would just have a Google Doc, but anybody can write on a Google Doc. And so once you share it with your friends, they can all write on there with you. And so it's very easy with a phone or a laptop to connect to people that you don't think they're connecting to. One of the things about this movement is that they position kids against their parents, right? Like parents are the enemy, even the whole drama around coming out. What will your parents say? There's that kind of an excitement to that. And so that's, they're going to be hiding from you. Basically, they're going to be hiding from you and kind of positioning you as someone who doesn't love them, especially if you won't acquiesce to all the things that they want you to do, like use their other pronoun or have hormone therapy. So I would just be exceptionally careful about social media. I would also be exceptionally careful about public schools. Know what's happening in your public schools. Get into your public schools. Volunteer. If your kid's at a school, volunteer there. Be the lunchroom monitor. Try and get in as much as you can to see what's happening. They're not going to always tell you what's happening. And there's a lot of social pressure there that you're going to want to keep an eye on. It is worth it, even if it's hard, to move your kid to a different school system or to start homeschooling them if you feel like they're becoming vulnerable to this or facing a lot of pressure on this. I know it seems like a lot of time, effort, energy, and money, but truly, if you could protect them in that way, then it's worth seriously considering, and I would do it. So those are the things I would caution. And then if they do say something to you, give as little ground as possible and pray like crazy. Build your relationships with them as well. Be not friends with them per se, but be their parents. Talk to them, know what's going on, pray with them, pray for them. Surround them with other good and healthy friendships. Just be their mom, be their dad.
Yeah. Maintaining that open relationship so that they are never ashamed to tell you anything. My kids are super young. They're still 5 and 3. But one of the things that I've tried to work on as soon as they reach the age where you really start disciplining, because whenever they're a baby, you don't really discipline. They don't know the difference. But around close to 2, and so then you can start disciplining. But anyway, and so one of the main things that I've always been concerned with is that whenever I discipline, I want to, address the behavior, the heart behind it. But I also want them to talk to me no matter what they did. To talk to me about it, I remember times where they want to pull away, but I wouldn't let them. Say, no, you're gonna talk to me about it, and you're gonna see that, like, even though Dad doesn't approve, Dad's not gonna hurt you, right? He's not gonna condemn you. And so I think, even if you're a parent like me who has kids where you're really before the age like this, that's where my mind goes. And how can I even start right now? My daughter, she's definitely the age where she understands that the difference between boys and girls and so on. But more than that, just make sure that that we have a very open relationship, especially in terms of communicating. In addition to be a parent, I'm a pastor. And so it's something that I have dealt with in my congregation. Had to counsel parents whenever a child comes out as LGBT, and friends whenever they have a child or sibling come out. And I've given some similar advice, but in your research and work, what have you found to be some of the best responses that churches can give and pastors for those who are listening?
Yeah. I think maybe one place to start, and I got this from Sam Ferguson too, is he said, at the root of this, the word trans, it's change, right? It's looking for change. And at its very root, we're all looking for change. That's even a Christian. Christians also look for transformation. Of course, we're looking for sanctification. We want to become more like Jesus. We want to, completely different. He said the difference is a Christian changes from the inside out, like your inside changes and then your outside actions change. And he said this is just a twisted version of that, where people are taking the outsides of their bodies and trying to twist them and cut them and sew them to try and match what they think they're feeling on the inside. But underneath there is a desire to not feel terrible anymore, a desire to be perfect almost, right? A desire to find comfort and goodness. And that's, I think, a place that you can start with someone is like, hey, I also want to find goodness. Like, I also want to be better. I also want to, be good. And I think Christians have the only answer to that. You can't cut something off your body or add something to your body and think that's going to make you feel better. We know it doesn't. The anxiety and depression and mental illness rates among LGBTQ population, especially teens, is off the charts. In fact, the more that society accepts it, the higher it gets. Like something like 75% or something crazy high like that say they feel persistent sadness and unhappiness, which is devastating. So it's not what the medicine they're giving themselves isn't working, but we have the medicine that they need, which is Jesus.
Yeah. I think that so many young people today feel isolated without community. They feel a lack of sense of purpose and calling on their life. And so they start looking for cheap substitutions of those things online. And then they're given this narrative from these, from these trans ideologies, which says like, here's a calling on your life. Here's a sacrifice that you need to make in order to step up into your calling. And, so one thing I think is, how can we as churches better call our young people to accept Jesus' cross, which, comes with the grace and forgiveness of God, but also comes with a mighty responsibility to now follow him in obedience and the adventure that requires. And then whenever they experience his grace and love, which makes them know that they are loved just as they are, but then more than that, that great calling to follow him. And if that then shield them from being seduced by the cheap substitutes that the world wants to offer.
That's really good. I mean, if you're looking at something as good as Jesus, especially if you as parents can just, all out love God, and they can watch you love God so much and see the way that he protects you and guides you and never leaves you and is always there. I think you're exactly right. Everything else kind of fades into the cheap substitute that it is when you have access to the real thing. Yeah.
So we talked about the aftermath of the story for Grace. What about the aftermath of the story for you after you hit publish? What have the responses been like to your article? Have you, I'm sure a lot of praise, because like I said, it was excellent. And so I really want to congratulate you on what an excellent article it was. But more than that, have you received pushback? Have you received any critical responses from the LGBT community or what maybe more progressive Christian community?
That's a really good question, because that's what I thought I was going to get hammered with. And it is possible that I did and didn't notice, because I worked on another project earlier this year about girls in social media, and in so doing got so scared that I left all the social media platforms. So right now my only communication with the outside world is at the end of my stories, there's a email address, and then you can just email me. So by far the most responses I have gotten are parents who are in the same situation. That is overwhelmingly the responses that I've gotten, and they are sick with it. I just feel, I'm praying for every one of them. It breaks my heart to hear them. I did hear back from one girl who was surprised that I would think that God didn't love transgender people. And she said, but isn't it like transgenderism is like the sunset, right? You're not really one thing or another. You're not really the day or the night. You're in between. Or like the beach, you're not really the shore and you're not really the water. You're that in between space. And she felt like transgenderism was beautiful like that, like an in between space. Yeah. Other than her response, which was quite misguided, yeah, it's just been those other things.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, we got a few more minutes. I'm interested to hear, you just made an offhand comment, but I kind of want to hear some more about it before we go. That article that you mentioned, you said you did about, what was it, teen girls specifically, social media, and how that drove you to get rid of all your social media. That's been a recurring theme on this show, not getting rid of social media necessarily. I do, recommend it for those who can do it, but just the influence of tech in our life. We've done a lot of episodes like that here on the show with people like Jay Kim, Felicia Song, and others. So yeah, tell us about that before we go.
Yeah.
What was that article about? What'd you learn? Main takeaways?
Yeah, it started with a book. I edited a book that came out last month, and it's called Social Sanity in an Insta World. And it talks sort of about how can women think about social media from a gospel-centered point of view. And then out of that, someone said, you know what, it's totally different though if you're younger. And they were spot on. It is totally different if you're younger. Your issues are different. The way you interact with it is different. You're shaped by it differently. If you come, it matters how old you were when you got your first social media account.
Yeah.
And so I was like, oh, well, then we could do a little follow-up. And so I did. It's also another podcast. It's called Scrolling Alone. And I talked to some girls who were out, they go to Berkeley, all raised in Christian families, all had parents who were careful with their technology. They limited how much time they could be on there. One girl, they didn't let her use the camera feature on her phone, or you had to use social media only in a shared living space with other people with you. That you couldn't get your accounts until you were later in high school is when you could first get on Instagram. Like these girls' parents clicked every box of what you would read for advice on how to manage your kids and protect your kids against social media. And yet, Erin, these girls, they're in college now, so they've been on for like 4 years, and they're tangled up in it, and you can just hear it and they can see it themselves, and they're so honest about it. And this one girl is telling me, yep, I have this brand, but I can't, and my brand is an interesting, like kind of an international traveler, but I can't ever think of anything to post in between. So then I thought, I could like go to the museum, and then I could take a picture of me at the museum because that fits my brand. And then I could read this book because reading this right book and having this right opinion would all fit within my brand. And another girl said to me, I love hiking, but I just choose my hikes. I noticed I was choosing my hikes based on what would look good in my pictures, not on where I actually wanted to go. Or I choose my restaurants based on what would make a good picture for Instagram. It is just so telling. And they said when they take breaks, one girl had been off for a couple months. And she's like, I noticed I can think better. I noticed that my thoughts are longer and more complex. I can think about situations better. I can just work through a book, where before maybe I wouldn't even be able to get through a page or two without having to put it down. Yeah. Another girl said, when I take breaks, I notice there is less buzz in my head. And I was like, oh, you are just killing me. You're exactly right. They said everything. And when I said to them, if you notice this, why don't you just get off? This girl, she was so honest with me. And this is what scared me the most. She's like, I just, all my favorite pictures of myself are there. Right. So she sort of curated a picture of herself, and then I was thinking, but you have all those pictures on your phone, but what she has, they're all in one spot and people have liked them. Right. And
I was about to say they have likes. They have likes. Yeah.
Yes. Exactly.
Yeah.
And she's like, and I have these followers, and I've been on for a while. So I don't know, a couple thousand followers or something. And I just thought, that's why I don't want to be on here either. I feel like this is sucking away my time. And that's why I stay too, because I've created some sort of version of my life that I feel like is better and more interesting than my real life. And I don't want to let go of it. And that's terrifying. So I let go. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. What you're saying about it matters what age you got on. It matters what age you got on, but also like the period of time we were in the social media carousel progress we've been on.
Yep.
Yeah, because so like for example, so I'm a millennial. I'm right smack dab in the middle of the millennials. My brother is only 4 years younger than me. It's actually like 3.5. He's towards the end of the millennials. And the difference between us and especially like my friends and his friends and the way that social media impacted us was vastly different. And I even realized it until a couple of years ago, whenever me and him were talking, and he was telling me what dating is like now with the influence of social media, and how there's this crazy social game that's going on with Snapchat and Instagram, and when you get posted on so-and-so's page and whenever they remove that, and all these crazy things going on. On top of that, I was already picking at him and some of my other friends who are around his age, how they don't ask girls on dates. They start Snapchatting it. What's it called? Snapchatting them.
Yeah.
But so that's just like 4 years difference.
Yeah.
If you go another 4 years or more to, he was telling me about one of his friends' little brother who's in high school right now. This young man he's in high school. He plays football. He's the star of the team. He's the guy who would have been, the star jock in those 90s movies that we had growing up. But he's I forgot how old he is. He's old enough to have his driver's license. He doesn't have it. Doesn't want it because he never leaves his house. Because everyone in this age group just sits at home Snapchatting each other or TikToking each other or whatever other apps there are.
Yeah.
It blew my mind. I couldn't believe it. And they're content to just stay at home, communicate with their friends with their phones, and if they ever do need to go somewhere, have their parents drive them. Just,
wow.
I mean, we're talking about maybe 10 to 12 years difference.
Wow.
From whenever I was in high school, and all those values in high school for whenever I was there would have been the complete opposite, right? And yeah, all because of the influence of social media on these younger generations.
No wonder they're lonely.
Yeah,
they really are. They're just alone.
Yeah. Well, I also wrote down, once again, so speaking to the listeners, I wrote down those other resources you just mentioned, Social Sanity in an Insta World. That's the book that you edited, right? And Scrolling Alone, that podcast you did. Those are going to be linked in the show notes as well. For those of you guys who want to go check those out. Sounds like excellent resources too. Well, that's about our time. And so thank you so much for coming on. We talked about some heavy topics, but I really enjoyed it. And so thank you a lot. It helped me out. Thank you for the work that you're doing. Anything that you want to leave our listeners with before we go?
Yeah, I want to say this. It's just following up on that social media stuff. So I want to encourage you, if you feel like you don't like social media anymore, to take a break or to get off. I have been off for maybe 4 or 5 months now, and it is really freeing. Those girls are right. I can read more. Even in a couple months, I can read more. Before I get bored, I'm more engaged in my everyday life. I'm more engaged in my own home and my own family. All that time that social media was taking, not only when I was looking at it, but when I was thinking about it after I had quit looking at it, is time now that I can do a load of laundry or think for a few minutes about like, oh, what are we going to have for dinner tonight? Or, oh, what would make so-and-so's day special? I know they had something big, at work, or whatever it is I just feel like my own life is richer and more beautiful now. For what it's worth. I know it's hard to get off.
Yeah, that's so true. So true. And I wholeheartedly agree. Once again, that's something we've talked about on this show several other times with some other guests. And I recommend, even if you don't get off of it forever, to practice a digital detox, something that Cal Newport wrote about in his book. 30 days to get off. And I'm telling you, at the end of those 30 days, you might just want to keep going. Yeah. Excellent. Well, I'll have your bio, the email in the show notes, so that if anybody wants to connect with you, they can, since you don't have any social media, for them to be able to follow you. Other than that, they can follow your work on TGC. So Sarah, thank you so much for the work you're doing. I really appreciate it. I've been benefited by it. I wholeheartedly believe that the listeners for this episode will be benefited from it as well. And thank you for your time with us here today on Filter.
Thank you so much for having me. It's just been a pleasure to be here.
Thanks for listening. I hope this episode provided you with biblical clarity to live with confidence in our confusing world. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please share it with others, post about it on social media, or leave a rating and review. To catch all the latest from me, you can go to my website, aaronchamp.com. While you're there, subscribe to my newsletter so that you can be updated anytime I share new content. You can also follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Aaron M. Champ. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time. Until then, hold fast to the